The reading this morning is from The Coming Good Society by William F. Schultz and Susma Raman. Rights are often asked to do too much. End tribalism and nationalism, stop violence and privation, usher in universal moral values and enforce them. No set of laws and norms could do all that. But what rights can do is to keep that vision of the good society at the front of our minds and offer some suggestions as to how to get closer to that ideal than we are today. Unless one believes that describing where we want to go as a human race and helping us to shape the journey in that direction has no value, it's hard to dispute the importance of conversations about rights. As the Russian writer and activist Alexander Herzen, whose polemics helped bring an end to serfdom, once observed, we must be proud of not being needles and threads in the hands of fate as it sews the motley cloth of history. We know that this cloth is not sewn without us, and that is not all. We can change the pattern of the carpet.
Back in January, for the sermon I did on nonviolence, I drew on the Reverend William Schultz's concern with our Unitarian Universalist first principle that asks us to affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Schultz argued that worth is not inherent. Many people, he said, display horrendous behavior like torture and murder, and he argued that the inherence of their worth is quite debatable, and force might be needed to stop such people. Today, I want to take another aspect of Schultz's ministry and focus on his work for human rights. Schultz was the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, the executive director of Amnesty International, the executive director of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, also faculty at Meadville Lombard Theological School and Harvard. In these roles with Amnesty and the UUSC, he saw torture, poverty, and enough pain and human suffering to make anyone despair that people are inherently good. And yet, as a humanist, he understood that we have the potential to create good, to move toward the good society, and that we do so by creating social contracts that are widely accepted by the public. Schultz and Susma Raman published a new book that focuses on rights. The book is The Coming Good Society: Why New Realities Demand New Rights. Perhaps the most well-known human rights social contract for us in the US are the Declaration of Independence from 1776 and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948. Our US Declaration proclaimed the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as unalienable. Of course, they weren't. Those rights didn't apply to everyone, certainly not people from Africa who were enslaved, to American Indians who got in the way of US expansion, or even to women who, according to some men, just didn't have the same intellect to have the same rights. But we humans continue to chip away at these barriers to rights, to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we've made great strides. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights may be less well known, but it has been adopted by all 192 member states of the United Nations. Following the horrors and atrocities of World War II, the UN established a commission to promote human rights. Under the chairmanship of Eleanor Roosevelt, a delegate to the UN, the commission drafted the Declaration of Human Rights, adopted on December 10th, 1948. The preamble, these words are familiar, asserts that all human beings have inherent rights. And now a body of international law exists to protect those rights. While we've made great strides, we're still not there. We still see torture, political imprisonment, enslavement, and inequalities. We continue to transform our world. Where do these rights begin and end in a good society? Eleanor Roosevelt said that they begin close to home and expand from there. She said, and pardon the gendered language of the time, she said, "Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory farm or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity, without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. So unless these rights have meaning here at home, they have little meaning anywhere. Rights may begin in what we see around us, in our workplace, in our community, in school, but Schultz really wonders out loud, what is the basis for our rights? How do we decide what a right is? Are they truly inherent in us? Are they backed up with something, maybe by religion or some kind of natural state of being or natural law? Schultz and Raman try to answer this question. They start with religion. There are aspects among the Abrahamic faiths that would point to a kind of reverence for humans, a reverence for humans in the Abrahamic faiths, and thus the need to treat all humans, especially the most vulnerable among us, with dignity and kindness. Is religion the basis for universal human rights that transcends borders and applies to everyone? Well, Schultz, as only he can do, writes that religion is not at all a good basis for universal human rights. Religion does not transcend culture in a way that will appeal to everyone. He writes, there are at least 22 major religious traditions in the world, with 500,000 or more adherents, to say nothing of the many subdivisions within each of them, and those traditions are notorious for not being able to agree with one another about what their own faith requires, much less agree with those of other faith traditions about what God requires. To take but one, he says, of thousands of possible examples, a group of 2nd century Christians called Montanists believed that only those who ate a steady diet of radishes would ever enter the kingdom of heaven. It took about 4 centuries for the Christian church to rid itself of that heresy. He wonders what we might say to the billions of people who have no religion at all. Would they support religion as the basis for human rights? The authors then turn to natural law as a basis for human rights. Is there something in our very nature as humans that everyone agrees we share? The ancient Greeks thought that that ingredient was our human capacity for reason. If reason is the natural law for equality, how do we explain why people who were enslaved, indigenous populations, and women did not have rights? We would have to declare them less than human, as unable to reason, which is what we did back then. Finally, human rights change from generation to generation, and our nature as humans doesn't really change that fast. Human nature just doesn't really translate into human rights. Schultz, as you can imagine, chooses a third alternative as the basis for human rights and the creation of good society. It's not God. It's not some natural law. It's constructivism. Constructivists would say that we create or construct meaning. Meaning is not inherent in anything. It is a humanist approach to understanding the world, that we construct our social world, our lives together, what it all means, and the institutions that support what we want for our world. Our use of reason may not prove the need for universal dignity, but shouldn't we construct a world that treats people as if they do deserve respect and dignity? We take it on faith that all people, as flawed as we are, possess dignity. We are in a circle of solidarity with others who suffer, as all humans do. So constructivists argue that it is in our ultimate self-interest to act as if people had dignity, even if we cannot prove they do. So rights are not based on religion or natural law, but instead on our circle of solidarity as humans constructing our shared world together. That said, science and evolution have moved our understanding of the universe and our place in it, and they have moved our understanding of human rights and the good society along. Schultz and Rahman's book bring us a lot of food for thought. If we construct these rights, if they are not determined by God or natural law, then do rights end with humans? The book looks at the stretches rights have made more recently, focusing less on the human part of rights and more on what it takes to create the good society. We need to ask three main questions when we're deciding what makes a good society. The authors ask, on balance, if this right is recognized, will it contribute to a greater degree of human dignity? Will it make for a good society in which I want to live? And third, how will the denial of this right harm a segment of our population and hence damage our claim to be a good society? In other words, as we construct rights, we need to consider the contribution to a good society or the harm it causes to a good society. Their book considers many rights that are being continually constructed and reconstructed. One right that's in the forefront right now is sex and gender. What used to be easily considered a binary, unchanged, and fixed natural law, we know more now. We have learned that there are far more than two sexes and a nearly infinite number of gender expressions. Fixed gender and fixed sexual orientation are outmoded. Things are changing. Attitudes are changing. But laws are slower to change. As rights begin to advance, we see pushback in many states, most recently in Kentucky. Kentucky rushed through legislation that banned gender-affirming care for transgender kids as part of a massive anti-LGBTQ+ bill. It banned any education of students, regardless of grade level, banned any education from receiving instruction on studying or exploring gender identity, gender expression, or sexual orientation. It further restricted transgender students' use of school bathrooms. The bill requires that schools develop a bathroom policy that protects students' privacy rights. Now, it doesn't mandate that schools or districts ban trans students from using the bathroom that corresponds with their identity, but they strongly suggest that's what the policy should be. Schultz asserts that bodily integrity, the right to be free from scenarios such as physical harm, invasions of personal privacy, and forced surgical procedures have long been a linchpin of human rights. A non-binary world requires that the concept of bodily integrity not be straitjacketed by the paucity of our collective imaginations. Human rights councils are clear that violence and discrimination of any kind against sexual or gender minorities violates human rights laws. This is a global belief, yet homosexuality is illegal in 70 countries and punishable by death in 10. These fights for rights take a long time and are fraught with conflict. People are afraid of losing something valuable, I guess. Schultz said that change rarely comes in a linear fashion. Rights don't appear in some preconceived order. Building a good society is not like putting Lego blocks together. It's a far more messy process. When new rights are established, it's often because laws and public opinion are reinforcing one another, operating what may be called a virtuous circle. And it is hard to get there, as seen in Kentucky and elsewhere. But it's important to consider who is harmed by not having these rights and who benefits from the rights. The status quo may no longer be adequate. As the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in his letter from the Birmingham jail, it is the passive majority that is the problem to civil rights. White moderates kept telling him to wait. The time is not right for change. Wait, while people continue to be harmed. As we continue to transform our world, we need to continue to examine rights and what constitutes the good society. Schultz and Rahman go beyond human rights to areas like bioscience, the rights of animals and the planet, and even to robots. At what point do rights extend to beings or things that are not fully human? What harm are we preventing? What good are we creating in recognizing these rights? What world do we want to live in? They bring in a portion of a poem by Mary Oliver, where she writes, "Is the soul solid like iron, or is it tender and breakable like the wings of a moth in the beak of the owl? Who has it and who doesn't? Why should I have it and not the anteater who loves her children? Why should I have it and not the camel?" So Schultz and Rahman explore what rights we should afford animals, if any. Humans are animals, but animals are not human. While many human rights activists have hostility toward animal rights activists, Schultz writes, human rights trump animal rights. He says, at the end of the day, no matter how much you love your pet or companion animal, if your house catches on fire and you can only save Grandma or Fido, you better save Grandma if you wish to avoid moral opprobrium and potential legal jeopardy. That said, Schultz and Rahman seem fairly sympathetic to the treatment of animals. Did you know there's a group out there that wanted to change our UU first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of all persons, to the inherent worth and dignity of all beings? These folks see us humans as speciest, and that speciesism is as abhorrent as racism and sexism. One species is better than another. One species is less than. You know, in some ways I can understand it. Throughout history, we've seen animals as something to be used by humans, unable to reason and not self-conscious. They were livestock and property to serve us. Indeed, there is significant mistreatment of the animals we raise for food. Cows are packed into overcrowded tight quarters, chickens loaded into small cages with their beaks removed, most animals overloaded with hormones and antibiotics, and some fattened up so much that they can barely move. We even give corporations more rights than some animals. The U.S. Supreme Court declared in 2014 that Hobby Lobby could deny employees contraceptive benefits because being forced to grant the benefits would violate the corporation's right to religious freedom. And we can't provide some level of protection for farm animals. Schultz and Rahman call this a human parallels approach to rights. When we make decisions, we need to consider that animals have parallels to humans. For instance, they are sentient creatures with lots of skills, some greater than humans, such as the ability to fly unaided. Yet animals suffer horrible abuse at the hands of humans. If a good society, Schultz says, is to mean anything, it must mean that such a society would do all it reasonably could to reduce the suffering of such sentient beings. Nonetheless, there seems to be something a little odd about asserting equal dignity and hence equal value and rights in all respects to animals as we do to humans, unquote. What are the human parallels? Do rights apply to all animals, from the ant to the elephant? And since we don't apply rights equally to all humans, should we apply rights equally to animals? Even if we deny some rights to animals, we need to consider some of the rights of animals, I would argue. The authors then move into bioscience, things like cloning, genetic engineering, the use of stem cells. Should we have the right to create a human-brain interface? It's already happening. If someone's brain is controlled by a computer, do they have human rights? What are the rights of beings that have been genetically manufactured? Perhaps the most challenging chapter for me is the one about robots. The chapter starts with a quote from futurist Richard Yonk, who has an imaginary conversation with his daughter in 2058. No daughter of mine is marrying a robot, and that's final. Michael is a cybernetic person, the daughter replies, with the same rights you and I have. We're getting married, and there's nothing you can do about it. I can kind of imagine that conversation, can't you? Do you remember that old movie Blade Runner? One of my favorites. In it, the Tyrell Corporation made synthetic human beings known as replicants. These beings were supposed to work on space colonies, but a fugitive group of advanced replicants escaped back to Earth, and the burnt-out cop, played by Harrison Ford, reluctantly agrees to hunt them down and kill them. I guess, do you kill them? Destroy them, anyway? The replicants are undeniably human-like. And while not technically human as we know ourselves to be, they had emotion, intelligence, and some pretty superhuman strength. If I recall correctly, in the end, Ford falls in love with a replicant named Rachel. In any case, he does not destroy her. Artificial intelligence is rising fast, and it won't be long before we can link AI to the human brain. I imagine you remember 2001, A Space Odyssey. Yes, the future was 2001, where the AI computer HAL makes an error and refuses to admit it. How human is that? When the humans on the spaceship try to talk in secret to each other to decommission HAL, HAL finds out about the plot to deactivate himself and tries to lock Dave, the human pilot, out of the spaceship, which would be his certain death. The famous line when Dave tries to get back in is, "I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that." As Dave asks to be let in, Dave has to take huge risks to try to stop Hal. Something like that actually happened in 2003. The International Bar Association held a mock trial in which a lawyer defended a computer's right not to be disconnected by the corporation that owned it. South Korea drafted a charter that affirmed a robot's right to exist without fear or injury or death. Others argue that robots are simply sophisticated tools, extensions of human minds that are not moral agents and not entitled to rights. Are they conscious? They're certainly learning. Is consciousness the only barometer of whether rights are deserved? And how do we prove consciousness? So if rights are transactional claims, that the less powerful make against the more powerful, based upon changing notions of what enhances human dignity and describes the good society, then we need to continue to work through these dilemmas. It is these agreements that we make with each other that will lead us to the good society and a good globe. The premise of this book has been that rights are not what belong to a person. They are what create the person and create the good society. Rights do not belong to us. They create us and a good society. Societies are constantly changing, being created and recreated. Schultz writes, because neither people nor societies are inert, what is created will eventually change, and hence many of the rights associated with the creation will too. Not all will be of equal salience or worth, but often we will not know which is which until we test them in the crucible of time. He goes on to say, the only thing we may not do is to allow a small coterie of smug savants to choose our rights for us or tell us which ones really matter. That is to guarantee the perpetuation of the notion that rights are the property of a Western elite rather than a global humanity. It is when we are harmed by the erosion of rights that we must assert our rights. It is when we are harmed by the absence of rights that we must create them. We notice the absence of rights right at home. We must construct them to create the good society, one we want to live in. Finally, if all technology works well for me, I want to close with a really short clip of Bill Schultz delivering the Sunday sermon at the UUAGA General Assembly in Louisville in 2013. He says there are two things that fill him with awe and have for his entire ministry of 44 years, 10 years ago, 54 years. They are the starry heavens and the sense of moral law. These two connect when we are in covenant with creation. When we exploit others, we are out of covenant. To prevail, we must never let those who would take our rights rest.